start the recording now and we're good to go.
Okay, great. Good afternoon. It's 12:07 and we needed a couple of minutes to adjust from the prior committee meeting to this one. This is the Finance Committee meeting. I am Callie Lessons, Treasurer and Finance Committee Chair, and I'll go around the room for introductions.
Andy Holman, board member.
Board member and member of the Finance Committee.
Larry Lang, chief of HR.
Jim Farrington, Treasurer. Andy Ratliff, Chief Financial Officer.
Jim Anderson, Chief Operating Officer.
Dora Wilson, board member.
Katie Parrott,
Amanda Foster, executive assistant to the board.
Great. We have 3 items on the agenda today. The first is our ACFR, and board members in the room have received temporary paper copies or hard copies to review during this discussion, and I believe that what we'll discuss will also be on the screen. Final published documents will be forthcoming.
Absolutely correct, yes.
Okay.
So we'll bring it up on the screen now. First, I'd like to say thank you to our finance team. Jim and Aurora and their team did a great job this year pulling this together. We did make some significant changes for us, although, how much the public or you guys really see a difference is, we'll see, but for us, it was a big change, making it move to the state chart of accounts versus the old way we classify the act for costs. So now we'll be in line with the rest of the state on how we report in our financial statements. And it saves us from having to do a secondary report that was our state supplemental report that we'd have to provide to the state anyway. So now it's compliant with state standards. We got rid of one of our reports, but it was a heavy lift getting there. Happy we did it, and it'll pay dividends going forward.
I'm sorry, I'm going to interrupt briefly. President Bellamy and Dr. Bryant are online. Am I missing any other board members?
No other board members.
Okay, thank you. Apologies.
So today we'll go through how the ACFR's laid out, and then review some of the schedule, see some of the numbers, go over what the district's financial position is, or where we ended. The auditors are still reviewing this, so it is subject to change. It's just a draft, but at this time we have no inclination that they're going to make any changes other than some minor format. So the first section is the introductory section, shows the district profile and just some information about the district, local economy, just kind of the long-term projections and what our enrollment projections are, just kind of high-level information about the district. Don't want to spend a whole lot of time running through this because we do have some other agenda items. If I review all these, it's going to take days. So the next section I want to highlight would be the management discussion and analysis on page 5. That is in the finance section tab, a couple of pages in. And this is the management discussion and analysis is the district's high-level view of what transpired this year. Kind of some of it's about what we expect to happen, and then describes kind of the basis of accounting presentations and how the schedules are laid out, what's included in each one. It has a few tables in there about our net position and our cost of services. However, we'll get into some of those numbers and some of the other schedules because it is really a reiteration of what we have in some of the other exhibits. But really, it's just the district's management and discussion on kind of what transpired. And that's kind of, we have a little bit of flexibility in what we put in here, but it's most of the stuff in this report is going to be scripted out by GASB standards or other governmental accounting standards. So that's the MD&A that we call management discussion and analysis. We'll turn to go to exhibit 1 under the basic financial statements. And here's where we'll start talking about kind of the meat of what's happened in the district and should put some numbers to that. So exhibit 1, Jim probably blow these up a little bit as you go. This is the statement of net position for the entire government-wide view of the district. So there's been separate components, and we break these down. There's governmental funds, which is our general fund, grants, transportation, debt service, food service, student activities, capital projects. So we have these what we call governmental funds, and we also have internal service funds, which are health insurance fund, our equipment replacement fund, and our compensated absences. So the governmental funds plus the internal services funds plus the other items that we booked in a full accrual method are all included on this exhibit 1. And those other items are going to be like the long-term debt or associated with long-term debt is one. Also, the IBNR for the net pension liabilities is all booked here rather than the governmental funds. So the state says our PERS and TERS is X amount underfunded. As a district, we're required to book our portion of that into our financial statements. So you don't see that portion on the governmental funds, which is more of a look of how our current finances are doing. So more based on spendable resources. And then our statement of net position and statement of activities are the government-wide, where we booked these long-term costs that may or may not actually occur, depending on future returns on investment within PERS and TERS plans. That also includes our government-wide, includes our assets, or the value of our building and equipment, and our depreciation on those. So when you're looking at the total, the assets that we have, you're not going to find all the, a school building, the value of that asset in any governmental fund. You just find it on this schedule. The current cost of it to replace it or fix or do maintenance on it, that's all recorded in there as current costs in the governmental funds, but the actual value of those assets are on in the government-wide statements. So that's exhibit 1 is the actual balance sheet that we have. And exhibit 2 is our what would be akin to a profit and loss. And exhibit 2 is where we really start seeing the changes in how we started reporting. Under the district-wide activities, we've broken that down into state functions, instruction, special ed instruction, and so on. Before, we had it in like 5 different categories between just general administration, instruction, operations and maintenance, community services, and I think there's one other. Transportation was the other one. So we had it broken down into like just a different format that was not an easy crosswalk into the state format, but now that we have it in the state format, it'll be a lot easier to do comparative analysis with other districts. Is there any questions on the government-wide? I mean, I know it's thoroughly confusing presentation with those 2 components.
Member
A
Higgins?
couple of questions. One, how much, when it comes to the property values that are listed, that sort, is that based upon acquisition? It's based upon assessment? It's based on acquisition, is that correct?
Yeah. So this is just the original cost to acquire or rebuild or major maintenance that's gone into its actual cost versus the value.
Okay, the reason why I ask that is because when we start calculating at how much it takes for maintenance based upon the value of it, do we have that somewhere else, estimated on the property value we've got right now? Because that comes up with discussions in regards to how much we're putting in for maintaining the buildings.
Yeah, and that wouldn't be included in this report, the estimated replacement value or anything, but we do have that as part of it's in the CIP and the 6-year plans and the facilities condition index
And
reports.
that's conditional on a lot of assumptions, like
I know.
that we don't rebuild it versus this is the major maintenance projected.
And I'm not gonna go into the
So some-
hour discussions, okay? I'm
We
not
want to audit it.
there. Just being careful. Health insurance fund, that's an interesting one because of course we had to add more last year, so whatever was projected, that was all. The liability there is really massive because you got, because it's all self-insured. And so how do we value, how does that get factored in to this and the external auditors when they're looking at it? Do they get that type of information? Do they incorporate that in their report?
So that information is going to be in here. It's not it's a internal service fund. It's not a governmental fund. So, but we'll get to where those are at in the schedules and how it breaks out. as far as what the auditor's audit is really just, do all our transactions have supporting information? Did we record it correctly according to our object codes and account codes?
Don't they capture the liabilities that you might have, or potential liabilities, just they only deal with current?
Well, we do have our IBNR, which is our incurred but not reserved or reported amounts, and I think it's $5 or $6 million. I forget the total amount. It is on the schedules of here's how much you could potentially owe in future. If you were to cease the plan, you have this amount that you're gonna have to run out. So we do have that recorded as a liability in the fund.
Okay, so in that sense, they're not looking at the plan that we got, or how we do it, how much we
No.
self-insure it, so they don't look at that risk factor.
This audit's just focused on, did we report it correctly? Do all the transactions have the supporting documentation?
Thanks.
So it's not nothing about plan design or even if it's over or underfunded. The one time they did make a comment on it was probably 10 or 12 years ago, when the plan had built up a lot of reserves and they told us to spin those down because there are some restrictions on how much you should be carrying over for one of those funds. So moving on to Exhibit 3 is our balance sheet for our governmental funds. So this is really where you get a starter picture of what our spendable resources are. And it's broken out in 5 different categories: our general fund, our grants, debt service, capital projects, and then non-major governmental funds, which are funds with a low enough dollar threshold to be considered non-major. And that's transportation, food service, and student activities. Those funds are all broken out in more detail later on in the report. So, but this is just the high level that is in this just basic financial statements. So exhibits 1 and 3 are tied together by exhibit 4, which is a reconciliation between the two. Exhibit 4 just shows the differences in the differences between that exhibit 3 and exhibit 1, what all items are not included, essentially from exhibit 3 to exhibit 1. But this one takes a considerable amount of time to read and reread and reread to fully kind of understand what's coming in and out of there. Exhibit 5, this is where we'll start getting into how much money funds either increased or decreased. So on the general fund, you look down and it shows our local revenues of 617 million approximately, and $552 million of expenditures. From that, we transferred out a net 10.3 million for a total of about 55 million net change increase in our fund balances. Some of that was due to holding our holding state money. So purposely not spending the one-time money we got from the state that year. A lot of it is due to unfilled vacancies throughout the year. And then some unexpected revenues. I would go ahead and take this opportunity to say that from when we presented in late July, I think we said it'd be a little over $30 million above the 8%. Our final accounting on that was about 42 million. So we did have an increase in that, and there's 3 major causes of that. The first one was the biggest one. We booked our obligations from FEMA. So at the end of the year, FEMA says, here's how much money you have requested that we haven't given you, but we're probably going to give you, type thing. So here's your obligations. That was a little over 5.5 million. We haven't received that money yet, but we have to record it as revenue throughout the year. So we did that. Whether or not that money should stay in the general fund or not, it is truly kind of unencumbered money at this point. But should we use that for facilities improvements or other earthquake remediation efforts? The other big thing was we closed out our ESER 2, the SRSA grant. We had about $4.5 million left over in that, and that needed spent out. So what we did was we transferred the cost of general fund teachers into there, and it'll just free up general fund money to be directed by the board later. And then the last piece was about $1 million in PERS and TERS forfeitures. So when people in the defined contribution plan leave before they're fully vested in that 5-year period. The district will get their money, a portion of their money back if, for what the employee is not vested in. The state has started refunding that money, and this year is about $1 million. We didn't see that come through until August, but we had to go and book it back, so. And that has only grown over time. It started out maybe, $500,000 to begin with for several years combined. And then each year it started to get bigger and bigger as more people are under those tier 3 and 4 plans, and that turnover becomes bigger and bigger, so.
She can't see me, that's fine. I'll
Sorry,
try.
go ahead. Yeah,
Anyway.
sorry, Andy's.
When it comes to the person to the forfeiture, so essentially you got employees contributing so much, the school district contributing so much, they leave, take their money with them, so they haven't been vested
Mhm.
with that, so it comes back to us. If they come back in and they want to buy it back, we have to contribute then to it, I believe, is the process, or do we? But regardless of that, that's what you're referring to, is people leaving before they're vested.
And it's just the districts, they take their own contributions, but they have to be vested in the district's contributions. So whatever the portion, so if you leave before 5 years, then they're gonna forfeit some of their money.
I have a question.
Okay.
So I think we had projected spending our fund balance right down to the board minimum. This was back in February.
Mhm.
And when you are saying that we've had almost a $55 million net increase in the fund balance over the course of FY '23, that's a larger figure than we anticipated back in February.
Yes, that did continue to grow throughout the years. We had more vacancies. We did get additional money from, we got several $100,000 or $1 million from the state for COVID mitigation efforts that we were able to charge costs for our nurses to. So there are a lot of things that went into that.
Okay.
And really, when we're trying to do those projections in, December and January, we don't really have a lot of fidelity, as we don't have a whole lot of months of cost to base that on. So we're generally fairly conservative. We see that money grow over time. But we do have some reports in here that'll show, where those categories are, what was underspent, and where we got additional funds. So Exhibit 6 ties Exhibits 5 and 2 together, the reconciliation. Similar that we tie the other reconciliation tied Exhibits 1 and 3. Again, probably want to read over that a few times to really understand it. And then Exhibits 7 and 8 and 9 are the aggregate of our internal service funds, the health insurance, equipment replacement, and compensated absences. And I'll show you where that's broken out in more detail later on, so we won't spend a lot of time on those. Then we get into the notes to our financial statements. A lot of it is just describing what's in the funds, our basis of accounting. There's a section that goes in and describes our investments, where they're at, the term length for them, what funds we have it in. Just gonna keep scrolling down. A lot of what's in the notes are going to be related to our retirement plans. So most of this section is going to be, here's how much you had in. And there's just a whole lot of information on the PERS and TERS and the unfunded liabilities and the other post-employment benefits that go along with those. Those are generally done by our auditors, and they take the state's actuarial report, condense that down by district, and then provide us with the notes, essentially. That one is still complicated for me to read. I've read it several times, and each time it's more and more complicated. But yeah, so in the interest of time, I'm going to skip to the tab that's the required supplementary information on page 75. So this starts getting into Exhibit 10 is our general fund, and this starts getting into our budget versus actuals. So here's where you can start to see where we started. You have that variance within the budget. Again, we talked about that a lot of the year. The investment income was one of the big ones that we had as far as exceeded our projections. We had a good year with our interest earnings, predominantly because the federal interest rate has risen so high, we started making quite a bit more money off our investments. Even though our mark-to-market investments didn't make a whole lot, our actual interest earnings were pretty high. The other things, there's in the revenues from the state sources, the $6 million from the public school funding program. A lot of that was due to increased intensive needs students and a little bit higher enrollment than we projected for ADM. And then you see the $16 million in the one-time funding that the board chose to save for this year. So as you see these numbers going up, a lot of this was, we made the conscious decision to save that money to help offset deficits this year.
What is the difference between actual on GAAP and versus actual basis of budget? It seems to me that general accepted accounting principles applies to everything, so it's a little confusing to me.
So on the budgetary basis, the main components are, if it's on the GAAP basis, it's money that's actually spent or accrued. But on the actual basis of budgeting, we would have encumbrances in there. So if we plan to spend this money, we have it specifically reserved from this budget year. That's the biggest difference. And then you see those negative amounts. As we go through more schedules, you'll have the on behalf pulled out of there. So the on behalf payments are in the actual on the basis of, or on the actuals, but the basis of budgeting, we pull out those on behalf payments because we don't budget for them.
What you thought you were gonna spend versus what you actually spent,
Well,
kind of close.
that would be so the variance in that far right column is going to be the difference between your final budget and the actual on the basis of budgeting. So that's really what you planned versus what you did. Even though you might not have actually spent it all, you do still have those that money encumbered for specific projects, which the encumbrances aren't going to be listed in that actual on the GAAP basis.
So just looking under expenditures, right, so it looks like we've got like $8 million more than we expected for special education instruction.
Not
Is that-
necessarily.
is that-
I would read that as we had planned to spend 91 million, but we only spent 83. So we didn't get necessarily more money for it. We just didn't spend the money that we had allocated to it.
Okay,
And that's really indicative of all the really high amount of position vacancies that we have in those accounts.
okay,
So every one of those ended up positive, and almost all of it's because of the high vacancy rates we've seen. So as we look at 23, 24, and then even our attrition rates for the 24, 25 budget, we need to start looking, how much do we think this employment landscape is going to change? Because we had $28 million under budget, almost a large chunk of that is because of the vacancies. I mean, a little bit of utilities here and there, but it's just not being able to spend the money we have.
okay.
And a lot of that's our own doing because we've kept contracts, low for the last several years, good better part of a decade. Frankly, the state hasn't been providing those resources. So that'll be one we're going to be tracking pretty closely to see where we go. The rest of that page, there's like a reconciliation between the GAAP basis and the budgetary basis. So that's kind of where you see how much money we pulled out for encumbrances versus how much we put in for encumbrances versus pulled out from the PERS and TERS on behalf payments. So Exhibit 11, that's a similar schedule for the grants fund. Just shows by grant how much we either spent or didn't spend. The grants fund by nature is always going to have a zero fund balance, just because it's a revenue equal expenditure type accounts. And then the rest of those up until, I guess the rest of those schedules are related to the pensions and other post-employment benefits. And these will tie back to what's in the notes section as well. Okay, so then we go on to the combined schedules, see how those are laid out. First section we have is our general fund. again, it does show similar information to what was on that exhibit three that had the governmental funds. This just breaks it out in a little more detail just for the general fund. See how the funds were allocated. Schedule A3 is similar to it has the budgetary comparison broken out in more detail. So as you go along, you can see actually which types of accounts in each one of those state functions are over or underspent. So like you see instruction, there's a considerable variance on that non-certificated salaries. That's going to be substitute teachers. Because we had to hire a whole lot more subs than what we probably actually wanted to, just due to we didn't have the staffing in our normal instruction. So you can get a better idea of where we are over and under throughout the district or throughout the general fund on this report, and how it really just breaks out and adds up to that report that was exhibit 10.
Just looking at general fund A2 real quick, I'm sorry, it popped out, the special education funding. I thought we were really restricted on what we could be reducing that funding. And there was all kind of issues with that. I know if we got vacant positions, I'm just wondering when we're dropping that.
With regards to the maintenance of effort requirement that I believe you're referencing, we don't, a lot of that they look on the, first they're looking at our budgets to make sure we didn't actually budget less than what we did, but we cannot fill these positions, and that may be an issue if we continually spend less, but it hasn't come up as the state hasn't flagged us for any maintenance of effort violations yet. But yeah, I mean, our instruction also went down, so it's also a comparative look. So you can't reduce special education by more than what you've done to other areas.
Oh, okay, so it's a percentage.
Yeah, you can reduce special education, but not if you're not reducing everybody else type thing. You can get waivers for it. I believe when Dr. Browder was here, we got a waiver to reduce some of those positions because they had so many vacancies. That's the other thing they'll consider is you have these positions, you're advertising for them, you just can't fill them. So they'll give you a little leeway there too.
I know we substitute some with contractors that actually cost us even greater, so it's kind of a trade-off.
Yeah. So the A2 and A3 is all general fund information, just kind of broken out in more detail. The A4 is a schedule kept similar to what we have in prior years because of the way that it's the categorization of it. What we found is for the people that do look at the book, a lot of the things they look at is your personal services and employee benefits. So we wanted a schedule that really kind of combined those and broke them out. So we kept this one in just as a matter of, not as a requirement, but as a matter of just reporting to the public and for our own sake to say, here's how much we spend on personal employee benefits and salaries. They just have it condensed down into a little bit different groupings than what those state functional objects are. Still got a lot to get through here. So the fee schedules for the special revenue funds, there's going to be a lot of information on the grants. This section got considerably bigger because of all these schedules in B6 are by individual grant. And that was a requirement from the state supplemental report that we brought into this report. So that's really the only thing that really leaked into this report much was just all these individual grant reporting requirements. So we got those in there. That was the biggest thing. The rest of it's fairly similar to how we had reported before. Again, just based on we did use state functions now versus the district's previous object level reporting, which was salary, benefits, supplies, services. Let's see, so then after that, the grant schedules go through B8 or B7. And then we get into the other funds, the food service, student activities, people transportation. And there you can see how we did for those funds, flipping through, food service, we ended up losing. Let's park on that one for a minute and just go through some of these totals.
Go on for it.
Yeah. Yeah, because we have to break down each individual.
one,
Okay.
like sent me to some page of it.
Our accountant that prepared those also thought they went on forever. You can all alone.
All right.
So going into on B8, B9, those show schedule, that's the combining for our food service, student activities and transportation. Shows how we did there. Food service, we ended up losing about 1.2 million. A lot of that was due to having to serve shelf-stable meals.
We lost, so we
Actually, we
lost.
paid for those, the general fund, but
But it was a $1.2 million loss.
overall in the general fund, or in the food service, we lost 1.2. We did contribute about 500,000 from the general fund to pay for the shelf-stable meals and then the unpaid meal balances. So overall, they're looking pretty healthy. They have 7.9 million remaining. Student activities, that's generally they can't spend more than what they have fundraised. So we never really have any concerns about that. That's monitored pretty closely. So if they don't have the money, they just can't spend it. That's not a concern. Pupil transportation ended with about $3 million in fund balance. From our budget discussions, we have about 2.5 million of that is going to be dedicated to spend this year. So that money will be spent down. But then the rest of the schedules there are really just supporting information for, or a deeper dive into each one of those activities and food service transportation funds. And then similar layout as the other ones, we'll have a budget to actual comparison and the balance sheets, income statements. Is there any question on those before we move along? Right, the next schedule is our debt service fund. In C1, 2, and 3. We did add a new schedule this year for C2, I believe, and that'll show a comparative between the prior year and the current year. So that one really didn't change. That was the only real change we had in that, and those always aligned to state reporting standards anyway. But we did add that comparative one just to have a little more detail in there. The D schedules are capital projects fund. You will see a large jump in the amount of money we have in there. That was due to us transferring in from debt service into the capital projects fund last year, the money we received from the state bond debt reimbursement. When the board allocated those funds into the capital projects, transferred the money, now it sits in there, and it hasn't been, by and large, it hasn't been spent. So that's why we have a large fund balance in capital projects. But we do have a lot of that money earmarked for projects. We do have to wait until construction season to start spending those down.
Where did we get the net difference between what's committed and what isn't? That doesn't get reflected in this document. It just shows the liability right now. Or what the reserves are.
Right, the commitments are based on what has actually been encumbered and submitted to vendors.
Yeah.
But generally speaking, the money that's in this fund goes through the
We
board for,
provided that separate report, that's all.
Yeah.
Does some of that get fleshed out on what page B on D3?
so D3 will show what our projects are.
It generally ends up going over fiscal years, especially because the summer projects, it's when you get the invoices. So even though you may have started it in fiscal year 22 in June of that year, you may not get the first invoices till October. So you'll see that carryover because you've already done a contract, the board approved the contract, but because they haven't finished anything and given you an invoice, you haven't paid yet. So that's how that happens. We don't prepay for a project hoping that it gets completed. We pay upon completion, so. And really, it's multiple points within the project, we'll get bills from many different vendors.
Maybe this is not an appropriate time, but sorry, I'm looking at page 225 still. With Abbott Loop, there was a prior appropriation. Is it still sitting there waiting to be?
I believe that was money for the.
That was for the fire
That- right.
suppression system.
So where does,
What we'll end up doing ultimately is using that probably for the demo.
so it'll continue to stay there
Yes,
waiting
ma'am.
for another 5 more years or?
Yes, because we had the authorization. We don't want to have to go back for a new bond because the way bonds work, that authorization, when the voter approves it, it never really goes away.
Mhm.
And even if we were to say we're going to give that back, there's no mechanism to reverse a voter approved initiative, right? So we would either use it towards the demo for Abbott Loop or just not use it. Or if there was an exigent emergency, work towards reallocating those funds towards something else. If all else being equal, you knew you were never going to need the money.
Thank you.
So the next section will go through our internal service funds. That is again, equipment replacement, health insurance, and compensated absences. That's on the next tab, Mr. Higgins. What next tab over?
Okay.
There you go. So here, we'll start breaking these out into a little more detail of how the performance they did. For the health insurance, that medical claims payable is what we're referencing is the IBNR or the incurred but not reported amounts that we might have to pay out if the plan were to cease to exist. So that's where that liability is held at about 4.9 million. And then with the plan ended with 1.2 million in unrestricted net assets.
That's the liability is certainly accrued, not the potential liability, it just had to be reviewed.
That's our actuary's estimate on how much hasn't been reported to us. So we have all these claims have been reported, but not these
In
ones.
process.
Yeah. The next page, E2, is the more based on the performance, how much money we took in, how much our operating expenses were. What's missing out of the insurance fund, just based on how we had to categorize this, was the money that we used from CIRSA to pay for the medical claims. I think it was about $3.5 million. So the actual operating expenditures on here are $3.5 million less because those expenditures are now living in that CIRSA account. So just be cognizant when you're looking at this, want to be upfront that, you know, that number is $3.5 million higher on that expense side than what's actually shown in this fund. Compensated absences, that's generally pretty close to zero as far as what balance we hold over, and that's just to pay for employees accrued leave over the years. So as employees accrue leave, we dump it into this fund for their benefit as they either use the leave or cash it out. So we reserve that cash value for the benefit of the employee.
Do we put a limit on reserve on how much people can accrue on an annual, so to top that, to stop that unlimited accrual liability?
Yeah, and that's based on individual bargaining agreements.
Okay.
So depending on the bargaining agreement, it's
Two. For which,
The carry on leave.
for personal leave, like the example,
We
ADA
extended
can carry
5
over
minutes
5
since we
personal
started.
leave days.
Yeah,
As they can make.
are you okay with that? Because I think we don't have a
Beyond that,
staff,
automatically
like,
cash out.
usually we're pretty quick.
yeah, so they're different limits for different bargaining agreements.
Gotcha.
So that's the governmental funds and the internal service funds. I'd like to point out some information on the statistical tables. I would say that a lot of these tables, or several of these tables aren't updated because we haven't received any information from the city. we pull a lot of our information with respect to property values, mill rates from the city's financial reports, which are not completed yet. And that's the one for their year end, December 31, 22. My understanding is you're supposed to have that to us any day now, but as of today, we don't have that information. So as you go through these are just the kind of the long-term look back of what's transpired. We have a 10-year term on here. These we did have to redo and restate the amounts for like table BB. We had to put all those 10 years into the state format versus what was in the district's format before. So that one took a little bit of time. But really it just shows a lot of information going back 10 years of how our fund balances have done. You know, what our expenditures were in different categories. We've tried to restate all that into the state codes. Then let's see. I think it's starting on about table II, page 244 is where we generally get information from the municipality. And we put a footnote in there just so when someone's reviewing it, they can see, okay, you don't have anything in there yet. And that's why. Hopefully we get that before we actually go to print the final version hopefully by Tuesday. So several tables in there.
I was recently looking at last year's ACFR, and I found it really helpful to look at 10 years of pupil to teacher ratios. So I just wanted to flag for other board members and sharing. It's on page 257, you can just see the creep as we tried to hold things off and tried to hold things off.
We did add, let's see. We did add a couple of schedules, and one schedule plan charter schools are still on table AB. Just shows the balances they carried forward. Family partnership is still listed in here as we finish the year, as we started on here for reporting. But then next year, you'll see that one go away as they're no longer a charter. I mean, they'll stay on this for the next nine years after that as those balances fade out. But it'll be reported as zero balances going forward, even though they'll have some carryover. The new reports you'll see are on table AD and forward. These are reports that we had in our supplemental that we wanted to keep. And some of these are state requirements like 264 and 265. Those tables are something we have to do a report on. And that kind of breaks down the fund balances into the different categories that are make up that 21.5%. But that 119 million or so that says unreserved, that also includes our reserve for bond debt, our reserve for how much money we plan to spend in the current year. So those aren't counted as reservations by the state's chart.
Sorry, could you, we're going to extend 5 minutes after since we started late. I know in the spring, there was some confusion at the state level about sort of the scale of districts' fund balances. So is that where we would look here to say, no, we don't have $188 million truly just sitting there?
Yeah, but this schedule still won't show that because we don't have the reservation in that unreserved thing. We don't have the bond debt pulled out or that subsequent year's expenditures.
Okay.
We do have a table in the notes that show how those fund balances are broken out on page 39 of the book. So that'll show exactly what items are reserved. That shows about $60 million of truly unassigned money. Again, some of that's gonna be up to the board's minimum, though. Not necessarily spendable, but it's because we have the board policy around it, but that page 39 will give you a better idea of what all those reservations are for.
And Kelly, part of the confusion was when the board decides to save 26 million of last minute one-time funds, it
Yeah.
does roll into fund balance,
Right.
but you intentionally saved it, so you could put it in the February budget
Right.
to help reduce the deficit. But when somebody's pulling it in September or January and they want to throw it out on the House floor and say, look at all this money, they don't see the budget that you may even have just passed where that money was used, because they're looking back to June 30th.
Right.
So it's really easy to pick the story you want based off the number you pick if you don't know the whole picture. And that's why Andy and a lot of the business folks were pretty busy last spring, really spending a lot of time educating the legislature on that number is real, but what that number leaves out is all these other things, to include 40 million of it is going towards next year's deficit. And those were the stories going around all last spring to try to provide clarity to, I have one number and this number, this is what it must mean. And of course it doesn't.
Well, and this is working about to muddy these waters a whole lot worse too, because in one of the, I forget the bill, but the legislature's required us to submit our current fund balances as of October 31st. So, and that's really not going to be, accurate as we haven't, it won't be inaccurate for projection. One, we don't start getting our city payments until December, so we haven't gotten any money from the city yet. In the way we structure our teacher payments, where they don't start getting paid until September, and then we have 3 payments in May, where we hold some of that money so they can have money throughout the summer. So the timing on there's a lot of timing differences that aren't going to be accounted for because they're picking a point in time saying, what's your fund balance? And my fear is legislators can see that, and this is what they're going to use to make their decision without it actually being any sort of projection. It's just a point in time that's going to be somewhat irrelevant.
And most of them aren't aware that the actual certification of the OASIS, which gives the final intensive needs that went through all the vetting and everything else, that doesn't happen until January, February. So there's all these projections. It's really inaccurate to use anything in October for so many reasons, but it will be misused.
Yeah, just get ready for that. It is a requirement that we're gonna have to
So
do.
that was passed, that's legislation that's passed.
Mhm.
Right.
So we'll have to do one as of October 31st. We'll do another update as of December 31st. And then sometime, I think in February, they're gonna want us to provide a projection of how we think we're gonna end the year, which will probably be more accurate data or better, more useful data for the state versus here's that point in time.
Okay, thank you.
So just get ready for that and the confusion that's gonna ensue.
That,
Pretty rushed job, but if you have any questions, we'll get the final copy hopefully in the next few days.
this will be an item for discussion at the work session on Tuesday as well.
The idea would be our auditor is there and he'll do his presentation about their findings on it. If you wanted to have some time to discuss it in a little more detail, we can. But I think we'll probably have a host of other things we need to
Okay.
discuss as well.
Okay.
We can also have a follow-up too in a future finance committee meeting after you have time to review it and then ask
I
questions.
think that's a
It
good
really
plan.
won't change.
Okay, well, in the next 10 minutes, let's pivot to the second item on our agenda, which I had asked for an update on what we've been doing to address our healthcare costs over the past 6 months or so.
Yeah.
And so, Marty,
Yeah, thank you, Member Lessons. So the slide that I'm projecting up here is kind of a shotgun approach to a response to that question, because it's no one lever that we can pull when it comes to healthcare costs. There are a lot of different strategies we're engaging to try to maintain a robust healthcare plan and make that affordable to the district. So I'll kind of go through each of these. The intent of taking kind of a shotgun approach is I'll speak to each of these a little bit, and if there is a particular area of interest, I could certainly come back and do a deeper dive on any of these. Probably the biggest lever we have is our plan design change itself. So we're primarily talking about the ASD health plan here, the one that is our self-funded plan we have the most control over. We have a health task force that's made up of 2 representatives from each of the bargaining units who are involved. Last year, about mid-spring, we heard that the projected increase for the next year was going to be somewhere in the ballpark of 16%. To provide the same plan as we have the previous year. So we started looking at ways that we could tinker with the plan design a little bit to reduce that down to not more than about a 10% increase year over year. So we worked with our broker. We were able to negotiate some discounts around our pharmacy plan. We were able to leverage the use of some coupons and rebates. We did end up raising the deductible from $3,000 to $4,000 and decreased the out-of-pocket costs for out-of-network claims. And so, unfortunately, that does help reduce healthcare costs, but it also erodes the benefits that we're providing to employees. So we always want to be very judicious in those changes, but it did help us manage the cost year over year. We did increase the employee contribution or the premium that individual employees in the plan pay by 5%. To give you some perspective, that resulted in an increase of, at the highest increase would have been $17 per month for any individual employee, or about $200 per year. This year, right now, actually, we are conducting a dependent verification. When we onboarded our current benefits platform in 2021, we implemented a good system of verifying that any spouses or children that people are adding as dependents are legitimately eligible for those benefits. So we've got all of the documentation. From 2009 up till that point, in 2021, when we onboarded Benefit Spot, we had a pretty spotty track record of doing good verification around those things, or we can't verify how well it was done. And so we are going back and asking anybody who added a dependent to the plan prior to 2021, re-verify that that spouse or that child is still eligible. Our intent here is absolutely not to remove healthcare service, benefits to anyone who is entitled to them under the plan, but we also want to make sure that anybody who is not entitled to them is not receiving them, that we're not incurring those claims costs. The information we got back from our broker is usually when you do a dependent verification, you find that there is some 2 to 5% of dependents who were no longer eligible for benefits. That window right now is open for folks to upload those verification documents. It's open from November 1st through November 15th. As we talked about in the governance committee earlier today, November 12th through the 15th, the Council of Great City Schools will be up here to conduct the benefits audit. This year, we also joined the Pacific Health Coalition. The coalition is a group of about 45 organizations representing about 250,000 individuals that uses the power of that large pool to negotiate really good deals around specific healthcare services. As a member of the coalition, we are then entitled to any of those negotiated rates. So it was only $3 per person to join the coalition, less than $5,000 for our membership, and that was a one-time cost. It allowed us to go in and look at any of the services that we're currently providing to employees to see if we could get them at a cheaper rate through the coalition. They also operate a near-site clinic, the Beacon Clinic in Midtown. It's a coalition health center. This entitles our employees on the ASD health plan to use that center. We're going to open up that opportunity to our employees on December 1st. It's a fixed cost for any visit that they have there. So it's similar to what we're operating currently with the Vera Clinic, but we have all the operational costs of the Vera Clinic. And so this opens up a second option for folks on the plan. We did re-up our contract with Vera. We did a 1-year renewal. They're under new ownership. They're now owned by Apree Health. So they changed their structure a little bit, but we did extend for 1 year. But as part of that extension, they are now reporting to Aetna, who is our third-party administrator, zero claims, so experiences, which means anybody who goes to Vera for a service, they will report that to Aetna. Previously, they didn't report anything out. They'll report it as a zero claim, so there'll be no cost associated with that, but it allows us to see for what services people are using Vera Clinic and to see what the cost of those would have been on the open market, which really allows us to do better analysis on the return of investment on Vera. So is Vera really working to drive down the cost of our healthcare in that plan? The other thing that we're doing is we've implemented a number of disease management programs under kind of a wellness umbrella as preventative care. So we have Hinge Health, we have Livongo, we have a couple of other options, programs that are available to members to help manage their own personal health issues. I don't know, member lessons, if you want me to keep going for the last 2 minutes, or do we need to wrap up here?
Well, we probably should wrap up. I did
Yeah.
maybe want to briefly pivot.
Sure.
I will say thank you for that. I know that it's of interest to board members. Representatives have, I mean, legislators have reached out and saying, requesting information on what we're doing to address our healthcare costs. So I think that's good information. If we could pivot to the third item briefly, which is
Real briefly, on
Real
Tuesday, we will have, at the end of the work session, the last, however much it is, we will go through the last capital plans brief culminating in the CIP, draft CIP, and the proposed bond. And after that meeting, I'll work with Amanda and we will schedule one-on-one briefings on the bond. We haven't done this before with board members, but because I did it with budget for so many years, it makes sense. And we can do it Zoom, in face, whatever you want. We'll get the team and talk through the projects that are on the proposed bond, why they're on the proposed bond, and answer any questions and help the board hopefully be much more prepared than in the past when you come in for action item 2 weeks later. So that's our plan.
but we will see the bond and CIP as non-action items.
You will see them.
On Tuesday,
Yes, you
the
will.
7th.
They will both
Therefore,
be
they would
posted.
be action items on the 17th, 19th, whatever that is.
Whatever the next, I don't want to do math in public.
21st.
21st.
7 plus 14 is 21.
21st.
Great. Okay, thank you very much. I think we are under our hour by 2 minutes. Thank you for that indulgence, committee chair. I'll, thank you all for being here. Happy to have a
President
motion
Bellamy
to-
asked us to say
Oh,
something.
President
I
Bellamy.
just have a quick question, planning question. Our
Yes.
next, we have a 2-hour work session on November 7th, this next week. And
Correct.
that's for the CAFR budget. And then we have the bond on the 21st. Is that in correct sequence? I thought
You might say CIP, Margot, but it's the CIP brief culminating at the end with the bond.
Okay.
Review real quick of the bond. And you'll
Okay.
also see those on non-action as right now, at least on the draft agenda, they're number 6 and 7, I think, the last two on non-action.
Okay.
But we will schedule one-on-ones with all board members between Wednesday morning and the following board meeting.
And
all right,
just
I was just
very
double
quick,
checking to make sure the calendar was right. Thank you.
and those non-action items would be publicly available on Saturday. Even
Saturday
afternoon.
evening.
Okay, Saturday evening is when those documents will be available. Okay, great. Thank you all very much. Motion to adjourn.